Daniel Lewis is the Dibner Senior Curator for the History of Science and Technology at the Huntington Library, Art Museum, and Botanical Gardens in Southern California. His talk today shares the title of his book, 12 Trees, The Deep Roots of Our Future. Please join me in welcoming Daniel Lewis.
Tanya, thank you so much. Give me a second to start the slides. I'm interested in many things, and if someone were to really force my hand and require me to identify myself in one word or less, I would probably say I'm a writer more than anything else. I wear many different hats, but I've had a strong desire to write since I was a wee lad, and I'm interested very much in the research and of course the writing, but also the whole publication endeavor. And if you have questions about that, sometimes it's an extended conversation, but I have plenty to say about that and plenty of opinions about how to succeed in that and what it takes to work your way along until you have some successes, I guess, in the publishing world. The other thing I do is I'm a commissioner for the IUC and the International Union for Conservation of Nature. I'm on the Species Survival Commission, which gives me a very great granular up close look at all the dealings of the IUCN, which is the world's largest global conservation organization and is a major feature in one of the chapters of the book. So here we have the cover as published in the US in March, and then we have the British edition, which they changed the subtitle. They asked me about it. I said, that seemed okay. And then they changed the artwork. So there's a different British edition. There's also two different Chinese editions in the works, one for mainland China and one for Taiwan. So two different endeavors entirely. I've got 12 trees and I've got about 40 minutes to cover them. And if my math is correct, that means I've got about 3 minutes and 20 seconds per tree. So some will seem shockingly brief and others I'll try to extend a little bit more about. And of course, I want to talk in some particulars about the two really southern trees, the longleaf pine and the bald cypress. I want to talk just for a minute about the artist who did the, let's see if this works. This will work. No, my slides on this. There we go. Eric Nyquist is a professor of illustration at Art Center College of Design. Very briefly, we've never met. He managed to get the wrong day for the book party I had in Southern California. He was going to show up the next week. But Eric submitted 72 different versions of the cover, all different versions. But I'm extraordinarily fortunate to have found him. He is renowned, and you've probably seen his work in the New York Times and in many other publications. And he actually did the artwork. I don't want to guess what this movie is. This is a Nathan Lane review that the artwork accompanied. I want to guess what it was for. Fortunately, you've probably never seen it. Cocaine Bear. And he said, and if you've seen the movie, which I forced myself to do, you will understand how accurate this rendering is. He said he had 48 hours to do it. And so I'm going to work my way through each of the trees, and I'm going to spend a little bit extra time on the bristlecone pine. And Eric did all the artwork for each of some bespoke illustrations. And this is perhaps a somewhat provocative title to say that a book older than God. But it's the tree with the oldest quantifiable evidence as to its age. And it starts to push up against the biblical literalist notion of a young earth. And so I actually wrote to about a half dozen biblical scholars, and I wanted to render a professional scholarly opinion about what would happen or how they would feel if a tree was discovered that was more than 6,000 years old. None of them answered me, which was disappointing. I had things I wanted to ask and things I wanted to say. Here's a shot from the Huntington's collections, taken at Big Creek from the Southern California Edison collection in 1954. This tree, Pinus longeva, or the Great Basin bristlecone pine, as it's called, can make functional cells for thousands of years, and it's an extraordinary survivor. This story is very much a survival story. It's sprinkled in small stands throughout Nevada and California and Utah, and between 9,500 and 11,000 feet. It's a fairly high level tree. So to put this in a chronological context, the oldest bristlecone pines have lived for nearly 2 million days, including leap years, and there are 1,212 leap years in that mix of 5,000 years, so it's not trivial as a sort of data point. And you can see the bristles on the cones that give them their name right there. One of the most amazing parts of this particular book, and I've got to move along here. I'm already 4 minutes and 20 seconds in. is the laboratory. Have any of you been to the laboratory for tree ring research in Tucson? An amazing place. So there are about 100 of these tree ring laboratories around the world, and by far the biggest and most, I'd probably say, sophisticated lab is in Tucson. And they give me a lot of time when I went to visit them. And so it's all about deep time with the bristlecone pine. They can make inferences and they can reach conclusions about deeper time than much else as it relates to the tree. And so they were founded in 1937 by a guy named Andrew Douglas, who was the originator of the science of tree ring research. He came to Tucson for the clear skies and the good astronomical seeing, and then he developed the hypothesis that tree rings could trace past solar activity, which they can, based on the sun's potential influence on rainfall and other aspects. And so he became a tree guy. And so this is an amazing marvel of a tree laboratory, 15 faculty scientists. One of the analogies I drew throughout the course of the chapter is between books and library, books and trees. And in many ways, they're much the same creatures. You can read them chronologically through these tree rings. You can understand things that are beyond the scope of the tree itself. And the lab's work includes, and it's not just the bristlecone pine, of course, they investigate all of the 12 trees at one point or another that are in the book: climate, fire history and ecology, paleoecology, multi-proxy paleoclimatology, archaeology, biogeography, geochemistry, biogeochemistry, geomorphology, numerical and statistical modeling, and even public health at times. Did any of you recognize this person? There are very few photographs of this guy. Anybody? Donald Curry. Does that name ring a bell? Anybody? Okay. I'm sort of testing my audience here. In 1964, Don Curry was a grad student at the University of North Carolina, and he came west to study the bristlecone pines. He ended up killing what was then the oldest known bristlecone pine. Audubon magazine called him a murderer. He, to his credit, tried to use an increment borer to extract a core from the tree that then they could date. He got help from a Forest Service guy. They couldn't do it. He said, cut the tree down, took the segment back to his hotel room and realized with horror what had happened. But there's a silver lining, and it's really the silver lining I want to emphasize in talking about this for another minute before I move on. So this mistake led to the establishment of the Great Basin National Park, which provides legal protections to more than 77,000 acres in Nevada. And the remnants of Prometheus, as this tree was called, end up at the Laboratory for Tree Ring Research. And they have all the parts there. And so to study them is as an extraordinary thing. And to see this tree, it still carries all of its emotional and physical freight in the course of seeing it. And you can do things with a slab of tree ring you cannot do with a bored core pulled out with an increment borer. You can, and they polish it and they clean it, and then they can look at it under a microscope. You can count its rings with unmatched precision. You can examine its cellular structure in extravagant detail. And you can learn so much. And it's like looking out over a landscape as opposed to squinting through a periscope is probably a good analogy. So not to say that Donald Curry did the right thing, but what he did has really ended up paying very long-term dividends. So for the book analogy, which I've now belabored a little bit, these are some of the samples. And you can see they're on archival shelves. They're labeled. They're in call number order, so to speak. They're by size, which is how we all work with rare books. They're filed by year. You get a sense as to the age, 80, 1200. Well, you say, why 80, 1200? That's more than 5,000 years ago. Yes, it's less than 5,000 years ago. So they've kept extravagant records of these things. This is a piece of ponderosa pine, Pinus ponderosa. It's an easy scientific name to remember. That has regular fire scars from low to medium intensity fires. And the ponderosa is primarily found in the west, the arid west, lots of different elevations. And it's clear there's a fire regime for the fires in an arid landscape, right? These are all evidence of fire scars from these low to medium intensity fires. But then, come on the 20th century, this is called the 20th century curl, or the Smokey Bear effect, because there are no fire scars that are present in 100 years. And it's really vivid evidence of how badly we've needed fire on the land for a tree that's pyrophilic, that needs fire to germinate, that has been evolved. You don't really want to say co-evolved with fire because fire is not a living entity, but it's a very different thing. Okay, next tree, the coast redwood. I'll give you a second to read the epigraph here. That's a condor up there because the condor is known to roost in some of the coast redwoods. And there was an article written in 1972 by a law professor at USC called "Should Trees Have Standing?" Any of you familiar with that particular book? Super important towards legal rights for natural objects. I think Elizabeth Colbert wrote a piece about it in the New Yorker a few months ago, a year ago. And it was a very pivotal moment in the environmental movement. And the essay lit this rhetorical match that has continued to burn pretty brightly today. And the idea is that it's really a definitive statement on why trees and animals and even oceans and the environment should be given legal rights. And he says this may seem strange to people at first, and then he very carefully builds a case as to why that is indeed the case. And some countries have worked this notion of the rights of nature into their constitutions. It shows up in lots of different contexts. And so it's really in some ways a through line for the particular chapter. I will say about this book that really what I've tried to do is combine science with sensibility. And I think it helps that I'm not a biologist or a botanist because I have a very imperfect understanding necessarily of the topics at hand. But I know enough to work my own idiosyncratic approach in with the science as I understand it. And I've tried to be very science forward in this book, and I've tried to be as authoritative as I can. Doesn't hurt that at the Huntington Library and Gardens where I work, I'm surrounded by some of the world's best botanists. And so I had a lot of help fact-checking elements. All the photos in here, almost all the photos are of mine. I want to read from, and one of the things that's true about trees generally in the forest that they constantly really are a form of sanctuary. And here's a bit from the book about the coast redwood. We gather around the tree, we take photos, we mug for the camera, we grin as we pretend to try to encircle the tree with our arms. It's like taking a photo with the president. Maybe that's the wrong analogy. Each visitor is just one of an uncertain number of supplicants for the tree's brief attention, and it will have a life far beyond ours. There's something congregational about the redwoods and their groves, a group of worshipers, petitioners standing solemnly upright before an even higher power than themselves, the calculus of wind, rain, sun, oxygen, carbon dioxide, and time. The coast redwood is about wonderment, delight, and ultimately the right of a tree to exist, to not have to serve as a means to human ends. Awe is not the exclusive property of tourists, monks, and rubberneckers. Scientists are driven not only by intellectual pursuits, but also by astonishment and by its cousin desire. To claim that science is impartial and bloodless is incorrect. So one of the best stories about this is, anyone know what this bird is? Any bird dorks among you? Yeah, the marble murrelet, right. So it's been one of its most mysterious residents for centuries. They've been called fogbirds and fog larks because of their preference for these cloudy, misty habitats. They were first described by the German naturalist Johann Gmelin, no zoological slouch. He was involved in some of Linnaeus's early work, but one of the missing details is where the birds nest. It was an ongoing mystery. The Audubon magazine put out a $100 reward for anyone that could identify the nesting location of the bird. A forester named Hoyt, what was Hoyt's last name? Hoyt Foster was up, and he dislodged this bird from a tree. It fell 150 feet. It landed unharmed, as fluffy little birds can. He went down, he rescued it, took it to the ranger station, was identified, and the jig was up after more than 300 years. No one, to my knowledge, has ever claimed the $100 prize. I thought about trying, but I think there's a statute of limitations. Okay, I'm going to move a little more quickly through some of these trees. This is the so-called lost tree of Rapa Nui, Sulphora toromiro. It's extinct in the wild. It doesn't exist on Easter Island anymore. It grows only in botanic gardens around the world, partly because the soil on Rapa Nui is so denuded and so deteriorated that it won't grow there. And it's a personal story about, I was born and raised in Hawaii on the Big Island. And I draw a lot of comparisons between Hawaii and being an expat from Hawaii and the tree. So it's got an uncommonly personal set of stories in there. a Chilean botanist named Jaime Espejo helped me a lot to understand the tree. He's been involved in the work to repatriate the tree. They've made more than 20 expeditions over 60 years to try to get this tree to grow on Easter Island. They simply cannot get it to grow. And Jaime, in his enthusiasm, wanted to do a ceremony at the Huntington in our Botanical Gardens with the tree. And he was going to send us a tree, and we were going to see if we could get it to grow. So he did something, I'll just say, patently violated every international law, probably involving sending botanical materials internationally. He took a book on cacti, he cut a square in it, he put the seeds in it, and he mailed it off to us. So I showed it to one of our botanical curators who blanched. He said, do you know how many laws this violates? And then one of the other curators said, can I have the book that it's in? Since we have a great cactus garden. So we are actually trying to germinate it, as it turns out. And I think we've cleared the boundaries we need to clear, and we'll see if it takes root in Huntington's gardens. This is some of the flowers from the beautiful little tree. Not a very big tree, 20 feet tall. The next book is the next chapter is about a tree known only from the fossil record. And I want to pick a few things nobody had ever heard of, and I think it's a safe bet that very few people have ever heard of. Hymenea protera. Protera hymenea is the genus and species of this particular tree, known only from the fossil record. And as with a couple other trees in the book, it's really a story about the products of the tree. In this case, the product is amber. And amber, although the things found in amber are often described as fossilized, that's not technically true, because for fossilization to occur, permineralization has to occur. So in other words, organic material has to be replaced by minerals, fossils turn to stone. They're essentially a cast of the original. But the things you can see in the amber record are extraordinary. And so you can see a spider and its prey fighting. There are two flies mating at the lower left, approximately 41 million years ago. And so they're deeply instructive, and in a way that fossils, as we understand them, do not. And so they tell us so much about deep time, about climate, about temperature, about environments, and an entire rainforest ecosystem has been reconstructed out of these creatures in amber. And it's been churned around the world over millions of years. It's come from different sources and different trees. This is almost all Dominican amber, which is the focus of this particular chapter, because that's where the tree happened to be. Here's another view of something. This was an interesting find. They found this 20 million year old flea with a plague bacterium, and they had no idea that they thought that some of these plagues had occurred during humans' time on Earth. It turns out they've been around for much, much longer than that, and it's much older than that. It's an ancestor of Yersinia pestis, which is a bacterium known to have been responsible for the Black Plague, the Black Death in Europe. So not a trivial understanding. And I have one more of these. This is amber with ocular dentavis skull from Myanmar. It's an extinct genus of lizard with an uncertain taxonomic placement, but it's probably the smallest dinosaur ever, technically speaking, discovered, found in amber. Amber is a climate proxy. This is a little squib out of this particular chapter. All that to say, it's really useful to have things that can tell stories from other eras directly in front of us. Do any of you know what this is? I want to read the opening paragraph of the amber chapter, because my editor at Simon is just like, the story you tell about the tardigrade is so boring. This guy should be front and center. So I rewrote that part. Animals don't get much stranger than the tardigrade. It's a boneless little creature, a chubby, eight-legged, microscopic organism that lives mostly in water, although it can live anywhere. And I mean anywhere. It's not what you'd think an unstoppable organism would look like. If it were bigger, you might consider it cuddly. Despite its sharp claws and a megaphone-shaped snout where you'd expect its face to be, it's a cute, clumsy crawler staggering along like a newborn puppy. The tardigrade has been reported to live in hot springs deep under the sea and beneath solid ice at both poles. In tests, it survived being boiled, frozen, dried out, and even subjected repeatedly to the intense radiation of outer space. One of the lunar landers, an Israeli lunar lander, was carrying a load of tardigrades a few years ago, crashed. Supposedly those tardigrades spilled onto the planet, and perhaps they're there still, staggering around. And so its evolutionary past and the futures that contains are embedded in the amber from this particular tree. So they found 6 tardigrades in the last 60 years And tardigrades don't fossilize very well at all because they're bits of goo, and the fossil record does not do well with that sort of material. There's no vertebrate, there's no vertebrae, it's not a bony, it's not a vertebrate. And so the things they've discovered about these tardigrades are potential clues as to how they evolved this incredibly useful resistance to radiation. Obviously something on everybody's mind, not just in a warming planet, but for considerations about going to other parts of the solar system and so on. Okay. The longleaf pine and its fiery partners. So I don't know my audience well, how much you know. Does everyone know the longleaf pine is a tree? You might see lots of, okay, good. I will tell you, I looked up a database of trees. I have a database of all the tree names in California for various reasons. There are 9 trees in California. There's a longleaf court, there are 2 longleaf lanes, there's a longleaf way, there's a longleaf circle. There's several others. I don't know why. I know what the city planners in those states had some affinity for the South, American South. I'll just go a very quick review for you all. It's been in great declined 97% since then. Needs fire to germinate. Unlike the coast redwood, mostly people that look at the coast redwood are interested in the upper canopy in the top 200 to 300 feet. For the longleaf pine, it's all about the lower levels of the tree. It's about the grasses, the flowering plants, the forbs. You know, or as one nature conservancy manager said, it's in the longleaf forest that diversity is from the knees down. So it's a useful way to think about it. And this is certainly true for longleaf pine. William Bartram, who is the big, one of the big American-born explorers in the colonial period, talked a lot about it. It's constantly growing in a changing ecological landscape. This is a flatwood setting, open woodlands where longleaf pines dominate, and the water table hugs the surface, as one particular writer describes it. And you get a mix of the historic map and the current map. Longleaf pine has, as some of you know better than I suspect, longleaf pine has increased in its range in the last 10 to 15 years. And that's an extraordinary journey. And trying to figure out what the range of something is not trivial, because if you have if a grove of trees and you have one tree, a single tree 50 miles away, does that mean the range is expanded where that one tree is? Not necessarily. So determining actual meaningful ranges are difficult, and not all historic ranges are agreed upon. This is a map of all the tree cover loss and gain in this part of the country here, and you can see how much. So it's important not just to understand what we've lost, but what has been planted and what has been growing successfully over various timeframes. You can see this. If I had this live, I'd click this and you'd see the map change, which would be meaningful. Have any of you ever been on a prescribed burn? Quite amazing. I highly recommend it if you haven't. This is Jesse Wimberly, who leads the quote at the beginning of the chapter here. And it's a great quote. And so Jesse is a part Lumbee Indian who has been involved with, any of you know Jesse? You run into Jesse? You have you? Yeah. So he's a 4th generation landowner and burner from Moore County. And for the last 35 years, he's been engaged in restoring his family's 1870 home and longleaf forest lands at the same time. So I have a lot to say about him in the book as a kind of representative of the people who are doing burning. He's engaged hundreds of people in the use of prescribed fire for longleaf pines, and it's been very useful. This is a longleaf pine that's been struck by lightning, and apparently struck this tree, which has caught fire from the sap produced by the lightning scar from a previous lightning strike. So I want to read another little piece here. Lightning strikes our planet 2 billion times a year. Ground-based sensors and satellites detect these electrical charges, which hammer every square mile on Earth. Lightning, a giant spark that can take place inside a cloud or between a cloud and the ground, involves a complex dance involving the collision of ice particles, the buildup of an electrical charge, and the release of what's called a stepped leader, the hot, jagged stripe of electricity that blasts toward the ground. This strike can reach an astonishing 50,000 degrees Fahrenheit, 5 times hotter than the surface of the sun. When lightning hits a tree, it can cause it to explode. The heat frequently also starts a fire. This fire is seemingly paradoxically a lifeline for Pinus palustris along the pine. I will resist going into a long tedious discourse about prescribed fire in the East and the West and about the differences on the land, but I would just say that in the West, the fuel load is much higher because it's hotter, it's bigger, there's more acreage, and so starting a prescribed fire in the West as a gross generalization is much trickier than doing so in the East. It's also true that most of that land is federal land in the East, whereas most of the land in the West is federal land. Most of the land in the East that is occupied by longleaf pine is privately owned. Excuse me. You guys all know why the Tar Heels are called the Tar Heels? Okay. You've probably all seen pictures. You've probably all seen pictures like this and about naval stores. You know, naval stores used to mean everything that was included on a ship: the wood, the sails, the rigging, and then by the end of the colonial period, it had come to stand for, you know, the tar, the pitch, and the turpentine. And, you know, those are all manufactured from pine trees, which of course North Carolina had in abundance of different kinds. And so North Carolina becomes a key supplier to the British Navy. And naval stores become central to the entire colony's economy. And I have lots of pictures I'll go through quickly here. People that are secreting oleoresin under these wounded trees as a protective measure. And then you can see these cat faces, which you see on the piece of wood right near the entrance there. And examples of it being shipped off to different parts. They float the barrels of these naval stores to markets along the coast. Then, of course, the Tar Heels. I need some socks like that. I think it's going to be essential. They'd also ship them, of course, and the way to get them to market was to float them down creeks and rivers so they could be shipped to places with higher populations that use the wood in bulk. And you got a good sense of the size of the logs from this image. This is an East Texas mill yard in the early 1900s. And then, of course, one of the most famous and troublesome occupants of the longleaf pine is the red cockaded woodpecker. So it's not all raw longleaf in the American South, and not everyone's a fan. There are a number of cleavages in the longleafs, I suppose, in its political ecosystem. The fact that the tree's not protected federally, but the red cockaded woodpecker is on the federal endangered species list. And so, and its only habitat, of course, is the old pines of the American Southeast. It's ironic because a lot of the work done in the 19th and 18th and 17th centuries on these trees to extract naval stores were the very thing that makes them appealing to woodpeckers now in the 21st century. They're weakened enough in a way that the paths that the fungus in the tree follow tortuously are accessible to the woodpecker, then works its way into the tree to create burrows to nest in. And so it's one of only 2 woodpeckers in the U.S. with federal protection. And so this has come up a lot. An article in the Washington Post said, "What's red, black, and white, and dreaded all over?" about this fight in Boiling Spring Lakes. Where's Boiling Spring Lakes? You know? Yeah. So it was a huge to-do because people started proactively cutting down their trees, not wanting to be forced with fines or difficulties in having to protect the trees that had the woodpeckers in them. So prophylactically, I suppose, they cut their trees down. And so that was, you'll recognize that was bad. So nobody won. And so they continue to work the difficulties. The New York Times said, "Rare woodpecker sends a town running for its chainsaws." You know, no wood, no woodpecker. You can't violate the Endangered Species Act if you're, you know, if the endangered species in question isn't present. I have so many more trees to go. I'm going to move ahead here a little bit to my next tree. So this is by far the longest epigraph in the tree, and this is really a story about modern medicine emerging from an ancient past, I suppose, is the way to think about it. The fact that there's been a centuries-old use of this medicine for beneficial purposes until they've done. And then I wanted to talk to people who understood how this medicine became used in modern medicine, and it's used to combat an extraordinary number of afflictions. The other story I tell, though, about this is the fact that sandalwood is so valuable. They do things like this too. So they cover it in barbed wire. They cage it, and it's very, very profitable. And there's a brick wall around one of them. And so all those things, they have security guards and guard dogs in some scenarios. And so in some ways, it's been a great difficulty as well as a great virtue for various parts of the Indian subcontinent entirely. This is a tree I found interesting because it had a story with music and, how do I put it, bureaucracy, I suppose. So if you're trying to grow, monetize, and transport wood in various parts of the money, you encounter an enormous number of bureaucracies in trying to do so. Some for good reason, some for really sheer the hell of it, it seems. Some of it for corruption purposes, and others for well-meaning but misguided intentions. And so Diospyros crassiflora, as I say, musicians, cabinet makers, chess players, and pool hustlers have lusted after for centuries after the wood of the ebony tree, primarily exploited on the African continent. So one botanist has described the wood as the tree world's equivalent of the blood diamonds of Africa. And it's stunning. It's beautifully polished. It's dense enough to sink in water. And it's also a story about music, hence the guitar. Taylor Guitars in Southern California. Taylor Swift plays a Taylor guitar, apparently. Built a mill in Cameroon that they then hired local workers to mill, and they would like to say, in talking, they like to believe they've kind of helped raise the middle class in Cameroon in a substantial way because of all the efforts and the resources they put into this sawmill and the efforts that they to do. And so it's a story about music and about this company that got a commendation from the State Department for its work with Cameroon. And you know, the blizzard and these papers represent the sort of blizzard of legal obstacles and the bureaucracy that are involved in exporting trees. Here's a shot of some of the wood. This is a story about the blue gum eucalyptus. And people have strong feelings about this tree. They either love it or they hate it. I find that to be a really fascinating intersection when people have such strongly different feelings about a species of any kind. And I've spent a fair amount of time interrogating this notion of invasive species. And I wrote the New Yorker a letter in 2018 after they published an article on the brown marmorated stink bug, which I took issue with. And I said, as Mark Twain noted, nature knows no indecencies, man invents them. Schultz, who was the article of this piece on the stink bug, Schultz relies on the same highly militarized and villainizing language that's widely used to describe other so-called invasive species. These critters have arrived in their new homes not of their own agency, but through careless and sometimes intentional handling by humans. Our breathtaking sense of exceptionalism ensures that our errant ways in bringing pests from elsewhere is never our fault, but some of that of the organisms themselves. They are blamed for doing what all organisms do, attempt to reproduce and survive. As loathsome as they might smell, act, or be, they are not the villains in these environmental dislocations. We are. So that's a hobby horse I've ridden off and on for some time. So the eucalyptus is a beautiful tree. I just really tried to sort of celebrate the aesthetics of it. Although there's some funny bits about how horrible it is, sounds and looks by some observers over the last 100 years. One of the things that's been very successful for is a windbreak in various parts. It makes terrible fence posts. It's not a usable wood in the same way the bristlecone pine really isn't very much usable wood. The olive tree is one of my trees. Again, it's the other tree, and it really, in some ways, it's more about the product of the tree than the tree itself, other than maybe the amber in the Hymenaea protera story. And it's really a story of olive oil. I'll read you a little bit more and get right to the chapter in hand. You know, everyone loves to draw botanical and zoological. They'll say it's found everywhere but in the Antarctic, or it's found everywhere but in the Arctic. So you will not find the olive tree on every continent, but olives and olive oil are found on every continent, including Antarctica. To confirm their presence there, I wrote to Tom Senti, who manages the provisioning of the food for McMurdo Station in the Antarctic. McMurdo is the largest year-round human settlement on the continent. The olive oil flows like wine there. In the course of a year, the station's commissary uses more than 180 gallons. McMurdo's population, highly transient, ranges from between 150 and 900 people, depending on the time of year. When you're stuck in a vast tree-free tract of wind-driven ice and snow, you need good olives in their oil. Green, black, and Kalamata, or olives are the 3 varieties on hand. Olive oil and olives are also a staple for their pizza station, which bakes up to 16,000 to 18,000 pizzas annually. So I go on like that some more about McMurdo Station, probably a little too long. But it really is a story about that, about the cultural impact of olives. This is a bonsai tree. The Huntington has one of the world's great bonsai collections. And I also talk about the bonsai forms of the coast redwood as well, and their strange simulacra. The baobab tree in Africa is really an endangered species versus endangered species story. The African elephant tends to gore the tree to get at the water. It's something called parenchyma tissue. It's not like other trees. It's a mass of pulpy tissue. And if you cut down a baobab tree, you don't get regular tree rings, you get a mass of pulpy tissue. And so elephants are goring the tree repeatedly and damaging it, often killing it. At the same time, these elephants are endangered. So then, we really kind of need a new calculus to understand how and what to do when one endangered species is endangering another endangered species. I think I'll leave it at that. Yeah, it's a beautiful tree. It's often called the Rorschach tree or the upside down tree. There are many, many names, local names, and then those sorts of names, but you get a good sense of the size of them. You can also see a lot of this is goring from the elephant in vertical striations up and down the tree. Okay. Tree number, oh, this is we're at tree 11 already. Okay, good. So I really like this quote a lot by Barbara Hurd. I don't know if any of you have read any of her stuff, but I just find habitat to be everything when it comes to trees, and certainly for the bald cypress. It's really an extraordinary sort of love affair with water. And, Thoreau writes a lot about swamps and bogs. We have the first 7 drafts of Walden in manuscript at the Huntington. And I spent a lot of time looking through those for boggy discussions about swamps. He really regards them as places of wilderness and natural beauty. One of the enduring mysteries are these knees, and you can see them sort of marching their way into the water from the dry land. And they're the people that look at these trees are often really intrigued by I have a laser pointer somewhere, by the buttresses, which are these fluted parts of the tree that go down and support it in mud and in kind of unstable waterland. But those knees, they look for all the world like they're termite mounds, all these straight structures, but they're in fact outgrowths of the very shallow horizontal roots of the cypress trees. Nobody knows what they do. There are many theses about this. There's a mechanical support hypothesis that's been somewhat discounted. There's a nutrient acquisition hypothesis. There's a carbohydrate storage hypothesis. Anyway, they've all been fairly well worked over and fairly well discounted. So, it's really amazing how trees can hold some of their mystery for a very long time. The other resident that's the most famous, perhaps, of the tree is the ivory-billed woodpecker, which foraged/forages, depending whether you believe it's extinct or not. Often foraged in areas where a lot of trees have been recently killed by flooding, so they live on the larva, and they originally occurred in upland pine forests, but by the 1890s, they primarily nested in bald cypress swamps, and they foraged in the drier margins where the swamps met the upland pine forests. Mark Catesby's view of the ivory bill. This is anyone know what this is? It's a swamp rabbit. Sylvilagus aquaticus, which is one of the few rabbits that can readily swim. And it's in and around the bald cypress ecosystem, and it feeds on the bald cypress's roots, and then it poops out the material. Other rabbits come along, eat it, and then divest it a second time. And if the swamp rabbit sounds familiar to you, you might recall, if you're old enough, the time that Jimmy Carter was out on a boat and he was attacked by what they call the killer rabbit. And he was apparently charged by the swamp rabbit, as he described it. We could still ask him. So it has a bit of a checkered political past. The tree's been used for general chronological purposes for a long time. It's not just, of course, the bristlecone pine that gets subjected to understanding. It helps, you know, the older a tree is, the better it does things. It sequesters carbon more. It can tell a longer, more varied story about climate. It can have deeper roots that serve better functions against erosion, and a whole host of trees being old. And so the oldest bald cypress, as some of you perhaps know, is, I don't know, 2,400 years old. It's gotten a lot of scrutiny. The oldest one is down in the Black River, in southeastern North Carolina. Here's a nice shot of the cypresses. And there's also one more thing I'll say about this. There's a particular salinity and climate change story with the bald cypress I tell here. And so although they're moderately salt tolerant, you know, there's potential intrusion from salinity with rising tides and storm surge. And it's one of the tree's most substantial threats because of climate change. And so they've done a lot of studies to figure out how to increase the tree's salinity resistance. And so one promising approach has been the use of salt-tolerant endophytes, which are fungi and bacteria, to inoculate these trees essentially and improve their saline resistance, in short. And so they've hoped that these inoculations will allow the endophytes to take residence, long-term residence in the root systems, and thus provide some protection against salinity. So there are many things that are being worked on. And then my last tree is the ceiba tree, Ceiba pentandra. One of my friends in Colorado invited me to his bachelor party, along with 5 other people in the boat. I think this is supposed to be me, glasses on. And he wanted to go look for harpy eagle nests. So who doesn't do that on a bachelor party? So our band set off, and we spent a lot of time. The tree, one of the things I have a lot to say about the IUCN, the way they assess tree and other species, other taxa in terms of their difficulties or their status as being endangered or not. And so it's in decline in some places and not in decline in others, which makes it awfully hard to assess because it's hard to give a blanket endorsement saying, well, the ceiba is endangered if it's endangered in some places, but not in others. So, so anyway, and one of the things I go on at great length about is how quickly the natural world can go from abundant to non-existent. You look at the passenger pigeon, you look at the Rocky Mountain locust. So populous was the Rocky Mountain locust that it would get on railroad lines in the American West and make them too slippery for the trains to run. They're gone now. And they estimated that there were 12.5 trillion insects, about 27.5 million tons of biomass. And due to habitat change and disappearance, they're gone now. By 1902, it was extinct. And we still don't understand why it went extinct so quickly that there are only a tiny handful of specimens that have survived in museum collections, because why collect a specimen of an organism that was absolutely everywhere? And so no one even thought to memorialize it in bug collections in museums. And here I am at the roots of one of these gigantic ceiba trees in Peru. When you do radio, especially live radio, you got to be prepared for any kind of question. And one of the questions I got was from somebody who, one of the NPR air personalities said, was his first question, said, in your book, you talk about how you swear when you're really excited. What? And he's like, can you elaborate on that? Like, huh? I wanted to say like, no, I can't. Anyway, so then I had to tell, and so what happened in the book is I'm walking along and I'm sort of despairing of the fact that I'm never going to see this tree because we've been marching on for some time looking for it. And our guide has had a plan. He's like, Dan, turn around. And I turned around and there was the tree. And of course, I let loose the birth of foul language and was excited to see the tree. So I probably made perhaps the mistake of that oversharing in that particular detail in the book. So this tree story really, as is the through line for all of the trees, are really in a way about all the multifarious threats that they are confronted with and all the things we might think to do to help them. But it's not really meant to be a conservation story, really, as it is about our relationship with the trees, how they make us feel, how we feel about them, and of course, what we can do to help them. And so, and I've taken a very discursive, journalistic approach to talking about them. I have one more part to the tree, which was this afterword. And it's really because of my archives geek background. And I wanted to say something about that in this very brief section. I'll read you one last bit here. I say, we record so that we can remember, plan, act, and memorialize. Without evidence, we forget our successes, our failures, and our germinating ideas. Science is a collective form of remembering, but not a static one, for gathering knowledge moves science forward. The dozens of people detailed in this book have come to know trees in their pasts, presents, and futures in very large part through record keeping. Oral traditions are resonant with elegance and can provide essential records from long ago, but the written word is different. Perhaps you played the whisper on the campfire game, where you're given a short phrase to breathe quietly into the ear of your neighbor, who passes it to their neighbor until it arrives at the last person in the circle. The final product is frequently unintelligible, but four-corner documents, and now their electronic counterparts, give a stable footing. They allow for nuance at the same time that they support precision, reflection, and doubling back on an idea. Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Ken Pugh. How do those insects get trapped in the amber?
That's a good question. How do insects get trapped in the amber? Essentially, they're in the wrong place at the wrong time. I have a line in there about their situation as opposed to in the fossil record. In the fossil record, they're in the right place at the right time. For amber, they're really in the wrong place at the wrong time. They're caught in the amber. Amber is exuded by trees from wounds. Sometimes that wound can consist of fire. Sometimes it consists of something chewing on it. We don't know exactly, since it was a long time ago and a lot of the organic evidence is gone, exactly what the mechanism was back then. It's a little probably different than it is today. We do know that they were caught up in amber, which is why you often see a lot of very last minute activity clearly by these insects who've been trapped suddenly and are frantically trying to survive. But essentially, it gets dropped on them or they land on it and they're pulled into it.
Well, this gentleman over here, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Kerry Hudson. One of the trees you mentioned, you said we only have, I believe the one was Eastern Island.
Yeah.
We only have in Botanical Gardens.
Yes.
And I'm wondering what other trees now are either in Botanical Gardens or seed banks, and that's the only way we have them. If there are any.
There are others. I'm certain there are seeds and seed banks that exist only in seed form. I'm not sure what other trees. There's a tree called the Willemmy pine, of which there's only one. And it was thought to have lived only in the fossil. It's known in the fossil record from literally millions of years ago until in 1994, somebody found one alive. But that's not the same thing. And there are. I don't know. Is the short answer. I'm not sure. I don't recall running across any others, but there must be. I mean, one of the things you can do in captivity is you can provide your own soil. You can have your own amended soil. You can modify it however you want. You can provide lighting. You can provide really essentially artificial conditions to keep them growing. Whereas in situ, much more difficult as opposed to ex situ. Out in Botanical Gardens, and they're in strange places around the world. About maybe a dozen surviving examples in different Botanic Gardens.
Dan, Edie Knight texted to ask, how many tree candidates did you start with to profile until you winded it down to 12?
Yeah, so why these 12 trees? Let me just say, I could have picked any 12 trees and I could have spun up really interesting and meaningful and relevant stories. Here's how I have come to think about it. So there are about 75,000 species of trees, we think. And if you think about a town of, say, 75,000 people, and you find yourself at a party, some kind, cocktail party, dinner party, and there may be 200 people there. And then you get to meet people. You talk to them, you look at them, you watch them from near and far. And some of them are elegant and quiet and beautifully coiffed. Some of them are really messy. There's stones all over the front of their shirts. Some of them are standoffish, but then warm up to you quickly. And it was something like that. And, in some ways, I feel like these trees found me as much as I found them, because I had my ideas in a generalized way, about what I wanted to say and what I found interesting about these trees. And a lot of it was very serendipitous. Things would come along that, that spoke to me about our relationship with trees and the ways that we've come to understand them or misunderstand them. And so I wanted ones that, in a way, had pressed up against us in certain and different kinds of ways. And they all, I think, do that. They all have had relationships with us. So the cocktail party analogy probably is my best form of expression for that.
Do we have another question here? We'll work our way to the back. Well, while Dan takes a drink, I'll just say that somebody texted in to say that they were advocating for some other trees like the eastern white pine and some other historically famous trees.
Let me just say,
So, volume 2, the next 12
let me
trees.
just say, if I had $1 for every tree that people had suggested to me, I'd be living on Easter Island maybe. There are many really great candidates. And I don't know, there really are many great people. I'll tell you a funny story though about that. So my agent sent this off at one point to a distributor in England when this was first in the planning stages. And he says, and I'll use a fake British accent here. He says, are there any oak trees in the book? And she said, well, no. He goes, well, no one's going to want to buy in England then. And so she told me this and I laughed out loud. I said, that is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. And I don't know if it's true. It's doing pretty well in England, actually. So some people don't care that there are no oak trees in there. And there are lots of ideas people have, very, very valid ones. And there are many fascinations, but hey, these are the 12 I picked.
So the question in the back.
Yeah, I think you kind of got to my question a little bit, but I was wondering if there were trees that were kind of on the chopping block at the end, or well, if you could add a tree, what would the 13th tree be or something?
That's a better question. Yeah, that's a more manageable. Let me think about that for a second. I'm going to give you, I'm thinking out loud as I'm answering this question. I wouldn't want probably like a fruit bearing tree because I've already got a lot to say about the products of trees. I'm interested in the trees that people love and hate, I suppose. You think about the eucalyptus as being a tree that people hate because people really, if you read that chapter, you'll see how vehement people are about them. They've been implicated in a lot of bad fires, for instance, in the Oakland Hills in California in the early 90s. But the trees that people love are the ones I'm, I suppose, more interested in. And I'm interested in the reasons they love them for. So I don't know. I'll get back to you. I'll give you a handful of suggestions. I'm not sure. I'd have to, nothing immediately comes to mind. And then I'll immediately regret having said the one I say if I say one, because I'll have thought of another one in the next minute. I'm going to keep that turning in the hamster wheel in my brain as I answer other questions here.
Got a question up here.
Hello.
Hi,
I wanted to push back on something you said there at the end
bring it on.
about recording and remembering. I think you said something about how oral sources are not as useful as written sources.
I don't know if I said exactly that, but
And I understand that you're working with longer time frames with trees.
Yeah.
But aren't there things, or did you find things out about trees and our meaning making and collective memory of trees that we can really only understand from oral sources?
She makes an excellent point, I've got to say, yes. And I probably overstate that to make the point kind of sharpened in the course of writing about the book. I spent some time talking to a lot of people in Peru about indigenous notions about trees and conceptions of trees. And one of the things they do whenever they leave one of these trees, and we saw a tree that apparently one of these trees, no other white person, at least Western's, ever seen. It was so far inland in the Manu Biosphere Reserve. And they offer up a greeting in the local Indian native dialect, essentially thanking the tree for letting people visit it. And that's a bit of an oral tradition, I suppose, that you'd be hard pressed to, they don't write it down. They didn't write it down and recording it to me, and I dutifully reported it in the book. But yeah, there's a rich, the thing that's tough is it's hard to be all things to all topics in a book like this where I'm working through a number of different things, but it could have used more of that. And the other thing is the Rapa Nuians also have a rich oral tradition about the tree that I don't really go into much detail about. So it's certainly a really important part of culture. And when you think about the fact that these trees are old enough to predate literary traditions and writing. In Hawaii, there was no alphabet, there was no written system other than petroglyphs until Western contact in the 1770s, 1780s. So in Hawaii, of course, I wrote a book about Hawaiian birds and extinction before I wrote this tree book. And there's a long, rich, by necessity, oral tradition because there is no other way to record it. Shows up in some of the petroglyphs. So yes, you're absolutely right about that. That's an important aspect.
Dan, you'll be interested to know she's a public history student over at NC State. And so her training is coming through.
Fantastic.
Thank you for that question. Chris Earl asked, why don't people love blue gums? It's one of the tallest trees in the world. So
Yes.
can you elaborate on what you found out about the blue gum?
Let my polished prose tell the answer to that particular thing. I love this. So there's a book called The Island of Missing Trees. Have you read that book? It's really great, by Elif Shafak. And the quote says, humans are strange that way, full of contradictions. It's as if they need to hate and exclude as much as they need to love and embrace. Their hearts close tightly, then open at full stretch, only to clench again, like an undecided fist. So eucalyptus trees suffer from some deficits that hurt people. So there's something called summer branch drop. In Los Angeles, on one street, 26 different trees, eucalyptus trees, dropped their branches, big heavy branches on a really hot day. A girl was killed in San Diego at the zoo when a branch fell on her and killed her. But I think its biggest detractors have been because of the fire that they have been implicated in. But there's a great deal of debate now about whether they really were or should be implicated in that. Let me see if I can find the story here. This fire was in 1991 in the hills in Oakland. Give me a second here.
So you're telling us one reason to not like this tree is it's literally a killer tree.
Yeah. One reason the blue gum makes such great firewood is that it's flammable. This quality is fine if you're talking about a region of the world that's only lightly populated. In denser urban environments, though, fire is a brute. Besides its shedding qualities, the bark also has a pyromaniacal aspect. In fire conditions, which are usually accompanied by wind, the bark will catch fire, curl up, fly off the tree, and up into the air to be borne away, a glowing bad luck charm, the perfect fire starter wherever it lands. In greater concentrations, clusters of the tree can carry an enormous fuel load. The 1991 Oakland conflagration killed 25 people, destroyed nearly 3,000 homes, and caused $1.5 billion in property damage. At the fire's height, it consumed a house every 11 seconds. So, but you know, who put those trees there? The San Francisco, so yeah, I read a lot of fascinating news articles about this fire. The San Francisco Examiner observed the air is filled with the crackling sound of blazing pine and eucalyptus trees, gas lines ejecting 15-foot-long jets of flame, and frequent explosions of propane tanks, trees, and electrical transformers. The Press Democrat in nearby Santa Rosa remarked that by 8 o'clock Sunday night in the hills above Piedmont, the eucalyptus trees of Mountain View Cemetery just to the north were burning like giant candles. The people of the press went on and on and on about that. And now there is some question about whether they really are. There's a great deal of dissent about whether this kind of threat, they really are a threat, and what other things might have been implicated in the fire. And then I have a long thing about that. So I think that's probably the primary reason. People also object to they're messy. They shed big pieces of bark. They're messy. They're also beautiful. They smell beautiful. You know, so range of opinions.
We'll take one more question.
Yeah.
Yes, sir. Wait for the microphone.
Thanks. Blair Pollock. In your work on the bald cypress, particularly in North Carolina, did you run across any of the linkage between the now extinct Carolina parakeet and the bald cypress?
That's funny. That's one of
Would you talk about
birds.
about that?
Yeah, they had a very similar footprint to the, say, the red cockaded woodpecker and the longleaf pine. And the Carolina parakeet went extinct, I should know, early in the 20th century, right? And relied on the bald cypress in a lot of ways. But I didn't see very much about that. The parakeet was found in a lot of other habitats as well beyond bald cypress habitat. It was found in parts of Florida where the bald cypress didn't grow at all. There's that famous Audubon print of the Carolina parakeet. There's 6 or 7 of them in a tree. And I forget the tree there, and I should know it. I'm in charge of our set of Audubon images. I'm not sure what else to say other than the fact that I have seen historic images of them in bald cypresses, and then I've seen them in many other settings. So
The reason I raised it was my understanding was that they had a symbiotic relationship, that those seeds needed to go through the parakeet gut to germinate in this area. And so
That's right.
without human help now, we don't get any new ones.
Yeah. Yeah, that's, that's a problem for many other species too, that you rely on. I forget the term. There's distribution by water, which is called hydrochloride. There's distribution by seed distribution by being pooped out. And there's another term for that. But yeah, I think that probably didn't help their chances of survival. I think it's safe to say.
Well, please join me in thanking Dan